You all can hear me, right? I think it's on. Flashing green. Yeah, it's there. I'll just put it closer to my mouth. How about that? Okay. For those of you who didn't join us at Hole in the Wall last Thursday afterwards, you missed out. I think my hearing is just now starting to come back. I think the band was good, but they were so loud I really couldn't tell. But that was an interesting place. I don't know if we're going to repeat that, though. I'm still more of a Schultz Garden kind of guy. That was interesting. Next week we have Mr. George Schaefer is going to be our speaker. George has been in and around Austin for quite a while, but he's also had a great deal of experience with NRG as a company. George is retired now, but he's helping with our PRP class on future utility business models, and he's going to come and give us a little bit of insight into NRG, the company, how it was established, how it grew, how it has changed over time, and I think you'll kind of find that interesting from an insider's perspective on how a corporation like that grew the way it did, and how it culturally evolved and why it evolved the way it has, and how leadership can often make a huge deal of difference at the upper levels. So that will, I think, be our last lecture for the series, because after that is Thanksgiving, and then we just have the one class session after Thanksgiving to kind of wrap up the class for the semester. So hopefully you've all been enjoying it, and please show up next week for the final one. Today we've got the pleasure of having Miss Barbara Tyran with us. Barb has been with the Electric Power Research Institute for almost 20 years. I think she's been there since 1998. Barb started her academic career when she was at University of Stanford, and then she went to Yale for her MBA. She's been working in the regulated and unregulated power industry for quite some time. As you can see in her title here, she's the Executive Director for Government and External Relations at EPRI, stationed in D.C. And you live in Baltimore, correct, or Maryland? Bethesda, okay. Another beautiful part of the country. She's been gracious enough to come out here and spend a couple of days with us. And this afternoon she's going to talk about the Integrated Energy Network, the research that EPRI does, and where they think the utility may be going in the future, how technology is affecting things that are changing as we go down the road, and what may be in store for us over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So we'll do the standard format. She's got about a 40, 45-minute presentation, and then we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A after that. Barbara?
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. Appreciate it. It should be on. It's green. Can you all hear me? Perfect. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Barbara Tyran from the Electric Power Research Institute, and I always like to start these talks by asking, how many people know about EPRI? Have you heard of EPRI before? Oh, fantastic. This is great. This is much better than I had ever thought. So let me, for those who do not know EPRI, which is the Electric Power Research Institute, I'll refer to it as EPRI from this point forward, I'm going to give you just a brief historical record of that. So actually we were founded over 40 years ago after the Northeast outages, and Congress at that time brought together the utility CEOs and the state commission leadership, and they said, we need to address this problem. We have got these blackouts going on. We've got this industry in disarray. What can you do, or should we be providing some inspiration around that? And with that kind of encouragement, the utility leaders came together with the commissioners, and they said, let's create the Electric Power Research Institute to conduct R&D, research and development, across the entire electricity span. And so hence, EPRI was born. And as you can see there, we are an independent, objective scientific institute. We are thought leaders in this space. We have always tried to maintain our public interest mission while also serving the needs of our members. And when I mention our members, you can see that we actually have more than 90% of the domestic electric utility industry participating in our programs and services. 25% of the membership is now outside of the United States. That's the fastest growing segment. And we do work that spans everything from all forms, and I do mean all forms of electricity generation. We're completely fuel agnostic across the transmission and distribution system to the end-use customer. We're going to spend a lot of time this evening on that end-use customer because that's where the real action is happening right now. So interestingly, I'm sure you all would agree, we've had a lot of change in our society over the last 25 years. I suspect that none of you owned a smartphone, for example, 25 years ago. They weren't around. And I bet that virtually everybody in this auditorium has a smartphone today. So imagine how that has changed your life, having all of the world's information in the palm of your hand now. Inconceivable 25 years ago. So what is even more fascinating, this was in the EPRI Journal of January 2016, that our EPRI president and CEO, Mike Howard, projected that we will have more change in the next 8 years than in the past 25. The next 8 years. More technological change in the electricity sector in the next 8 years. That's 2024, not very far from now. So imagine the kind of ride we're about to begin and how exciting that is. So what does that mean when we're talking about the actual electricity sector? At EPRI, we share the mission with the industry that we want to provide reliable, affordable, and environmentally sustainable electricity, always conducted in a very safe manner. And so we try to adhere to that. As I mentioned, we have a public interest mission, and we also try to serve our members' needs in that capacity. But as we have gone forward, that old utility business model has changed substantially. We have gone from baseload generation plants, power plants, where they generated power. It was then transmitted and distributed to the customer, one-way power flow. So that has been the model for 140 years. Now what we have is a very new model. We have the ability for customers to generate their own electricity with solar photovoltaics, PVs as they're called. So now they can actually generate electricity, but they want to sell it back into the system if they have excess availability. That's two-way power flow. So the best example of what this means, it's as if University Avenue, when you came in here this evening, was a one-way street, and traffic lights and stop signs were all posted in that one-way direction for the traffic. And we come out of here tonight, and it's a two-way street, but the traffic lights and the street signs have not changed. So the oncoming traffic has no information. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. They don't have any awareness of what's going on. The signage is all still in one direction. That is the change we need to make happen in the electricity sector. If we have bidirectional flow of electricity, we need to have street signs that can communicate to everybody going back and forth. So we call this situational awareness. And what we're trying to do through sensors that can convey intelligent communications and are really actually very cheap, but we need them to control the system. We need to get them deployed throughout that transmission and distribution system so they can achieve that communications, that two-way communications effort that is needed today and didn't exist previously. So we know today that we have an interconnected system. We do have the capability to bring in customer-generated electricity and then use it in the T&D system to sell to other customers. It's connected. But what is missing is the distribution system operator doesn't necessarily know where those generating sources are. They don't know where the EV charging station is. They may have been told, but they may not have been told. It's pretty hard to keep a system in synchronous balance with the load and the demand always in balance if you don't know where things are. That's called situational awareness. That's what those sensors with the communications and intelligence can do. They can help those distribution system operators understand where load is being used, where an electric vehicle is being charged, where somebody is generating extra electricity from their rooftop solar. That can help understand where that is so they can keep the system always in balance. That is an integrated system. That is a system that is using all of its resources cost effectively. There are no stranded assets, and we are integrating those capabilities across the entire system and adapting to the new model. So as we look at this, we see that this is all changing quite rapidly. It used to be, as I mentioned, that the baseload generation plants were the ones that provided the electricity and then sold it to the customer. But now, particularly in states where you have renewable energy dispatch, in other words, where renewable energy has to go first, has to be used first ahead of other fuels, those central power plants are being asked to back down. They're being asked to back down and ramp down so that the renewable can be pushed out first. That's okay, but they were not constructed to do that. So we're asking them to ramp down and then ramp back up when the renewable energy is not available. Ramp down and ramp back up. That creates a lot of wear and tear. It's a very exciting challenge for our scientists and engineers to figure out how to make those materials in those power plants more robust so they can withstand the wear and tear, but they were not designed that way and they are not originally constructed that way, so they need to be modified to accommodate that change. Similarly, the T&D, the transmission and distribution system, needs to be updated and upgraded to allow, as I've mentioned, the communications and intelligence to allow that bidirectional flow. And then we also have to make sure that we're forecasting when the renewable energy is available. It's a much more interactive system now. When is renewable energy available? When is it dark? When is there solar available? When is there wind available? We are trying to forecast this, but it's still something that is a variable resource. It is not a fixed generation source. The best example I like to give on this is that it's like asking that baseload generation that used to be an Indy race car going around, lapping the track as fast as it could, peak capabilities, and now being plunked into Midtown Manhattan and asked to be not a race car, but a taxi cab. Start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. You can take an Indy race car driver and the car and put them in Manhattan, but you're going to have to re-educate the driver and you're going to have to change over the car in order to accommodate that new system. That's the kind of transformation that we're doing with the baseload facilities. So when we don't understand fully what's going on, and I'll step out of your way here so you can all see, when we don't understand exactly what it means to be locating the distributed energy resources, the solar PV, for example, on the system, and we are just going about it without intelligent communications, watch what happens on the screen. This is a computer simulation, but you'll see that the system cannot host the new, as we call it, cannot host the new DER as it becomes more and more congested. And you can see there that this process, we keep repeating it by adding more and more penetration of DER. Again, a computer simulation, very cost effective, that shows, and here's another example of it, that we're continuing to add that on the system, but there are repercussions to that. So this is a hypothetical model, but with the increasing penetration, you reach a point where the system is compromised. There's a lot of work that can be done on that. In fact, just this summer, we released a new report, which is called the Locational Value of DER. And actually, Fred and I were talking about this earlier this afternoon. It is so precisely important where specifically the DER is located. So it's not on the house across the street. It's not even on the house next to yours. It's where it is on yours that can allow for the maximum absorption of the DER on that distribution system. It is incredibly precise. That is a huge aha that we've learned. It not only is important in terms of what the value of that resource is to the utility and to the customer, it's also incredibly important as to how well it can be absorbed into the distribution system. That extra energy can be absorbed into the distribution system or might actually assist the distribution system, more importantly. So this is a very important area. And we are going to be doing some work. This is all what I just showed you, a computer simulation, as I mentioned. But we are starting some pilots now that will go into individual host utilities and look at this on the individual feeders. Now, a feeder is the distribution line. We can't go in, and it would not be smart and it would not be cost effective to go into the thousands of different feeders across the country and test for the congestion and hosting capabilities. But what is helpful is to go into selected few that may have some strategic learnings that can come, and then to share those learnings across the region and with like utilities so that we can begin to understand more through those field tests and those on-site experiments what R&D gaps exist, what technology gaps exist, and where the system actually works really well. So those are the kinds of pilot efforts that are underway now. And we're finding that it's hugely important, as I said, to learn. Every feeder, keep in mind, is like a snowflake. It's unique. So it's very helpful to get out in the field and find out exactly what's going on. And here we see that once again, if we don't have that full understanding, we then essentially max out the hosting capacity of the system. So as like everything in society today, the customer is really changing their relationship with the electric utility. It's not the same way as it was for 140 years. The technology is not the same way that it's been for 140 years. So customers today, I suspect you may all share this, you want to have some choice in how you interact with your technology. You want to have convenience. You want to have control over it. And you want it to be comfortable. You want it comfortable for you, whoever you are, whatever your preferences are. So all of those, the 4 C's we refer to them, are driving the customer experience with their electric utility. There used to not be that whole dynamic. This is all brand new, but it's continuing to change. And the other interesting insight from this is, not surprisingly, I'm sure to you, but customers are not monolithic. What appeals maybe to one person over here might not be the person's preference over there. So they have individual preferences that they want to express in this relationship with electricity. Some want no relationship. Some want a very interactive. And over the course of time, it may change. But we're trying to understand more and more about that and what that means in terms of engaging the utility-customer relationship. So you can see that there are a lot of different factors technologically. We are seeing the advent of energy storage, which will change the entire equation. So rather than having synchronous load balance where you generate electricity and you use electricity, you could generate electricity when it's cheap, you could store it, and you could use it when you need it, which would change the entire equation of how this business has been conducted for over 100 years. That's a huge technology breakthrough. I've talked about the behavioral initiatives, trying to understand more about what customers would like from their utility, what they would not like. And then as we look at energy efficiency, ways that we can all save energy, and demand response, where perhaps a customer may say, yes, you can actually lower my electricity usage for a short period of time, perhaps give me a credit on my bill for that, and instead you, the utility, can use that energy for something else that you think you deem worthy. That's demand response, and we're finding that there is a persistent interest by customers in demand response. So these are some of these optionalities that are changing that didn't even exist 25 or 50 years ago. Now, as we invite the customer, the individual customer, to begin to express their preferences more, you have to remember we're a nonprofit organization that wants to support the societal good. So we need to take those individual preferences and now somehow aggregate it so that one customer class is not benefiting against another, that one customer type is not leveraged in a way that disadvantages another, so that there's an aggregated common good for all of society that comes from the individual preferences. We don't want to take away their ability to have preferences, but we want to make sure that no one is hurt in that process and the overall societal goals go forward. So that is a very interesting challenge that's part of this whole integration process, is how to make this cost-effective and beneficial for everyone. So as we look ahead, we know that electricity is becoming even more important in our lives with new technologies. I've mentioned some of them, but there are many more to come. We are just beginning this journey together. So you see there on the screen, for example, that there's nanotechnologies mentioned. Nanotechnologies, the manufacturing of them require quite a bit of electricity. But the definition of nanotechnology is that it is 100,000 times smaller than a human hair. That industry is a $2.6 trillion business right now. I suspect that's not going to stay at $2.6 trillion. It's only going to ramp up. So electricity becomes more and more important with all these new technologies. We know that we have data centers. In fact, if you've been reading the news, Facebook was looking in various states as to where to locate their next data center because they're very energy intensive, and they chose the state of New Mexico. But data centers use a huge amount of energy. So how much do they use and how much is generated? IBM predicts that today we are generated in the United States 2.5 exabytes of data every day. Now, an exabyte, I had to look that up. I was like, what is an exabyte? So, and maybe you haven't heard of an exabyte either, so I will share what I learned, which is an exabyte is 10 to the 18th power. So 2.5 times 10 to the 18th power bytes of data created every day. Which direction is that going? Only up. So again, a lot more around electrification of the system and the need to have energy efficiency where we can, but increasing need for electricity in brand new areas that did not previously exist. Now, one new dimension that we're going to be looking at EPRI in 2017, and I will leave you with this preview, is that we're going to be looking at something which was the title of this presentation, the Integrated Energy Network. So as we look at what this 21st century is, we see, as I've described, increasing electrification, not only in this country and the first world with advancing technologies, but we have billions of people on the planet and more billions to come by the middle of the century who have limited or no access to electricity. You cannot participate in the digital economy very successfully without access to electricity, much less basic health care, comfort, convenience, some of the other attributes that it provides. So they're going to be, I suspect, wanting to have electricity access. And we're going to need, as I've said, more electricity here. Is there a way, perhaps, as we look at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and trying to improve the environment over the 21st century, is there a way that as the electricity sector uses cleaner and cleaner generation sources through renewables and others that we've talked about here today, is there a way that we could bring electricity into the other sectors of the economy to help them with their environmental compliance? First case in point, transportation. So today we have electric vehicles. We have begun to electrify the transportation sector. That will enable that economic sector to become more environmentally compliant. As we go forward, there are going to be more and more examples of that where we have diesel motors at seaports and airports that can become electrified, where we can see the possibilities for new ways for electricity to move into the other sectors of the economy. As that electrification process goes forward, we will be able to meet that rising energy demand, but also decrease the environmental impact. That's the vision of the Integrated Energy Network. We will be releasing a full report in Q1 of 2017. I hope you will hear a lot more about it. We anticipate it'll be about a 3 to 5 year effort. And everything that I have shown you here today on the integrated grid work, on the many white papers that backed up this work, as well as the upcoming Integrated Energy Network, are all publicly available at www.epri.com. So if you have interest, I encourage you to go to our website and look, and I would be happy to answer any questions at this time, and I appreciate your thoughtful attention. Thanks so much. Comments or questions? Yes, please.
I have a question about how EPRI sees the economics. Oh, thank you, Fred. A question about how EPRI, what their perspective is on the economics of storage, and I mean that in a couple different ways. Obviously, the economics will depend on the local prices, and then I'm also thinking of the economics of the distributed solar storage for that, and the economics of storage for a utility scale.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So storage is the huge breakthrough because it's going to change that capability. The economics are improving for storage. The costs are coming down, but I am told by our storage experts that we're going to be in what chemically is the lithium-ion family for storage for about a decade. And there's going to be some promising opportunities probably in other chemical families after that. But right now, we're just working on advancing the technology there, bringing the costs down there. I think we'll see, and we have seen progress, but there's not going to be any big out-of-the-box development, at least as it's expected right now. In terms of the cost factors, why that will all, as those costs continue to come down, those will be differentiated. It looks like you have a follow-up question.
I forgot to ask, do you have any sort of general time frames? That's what I was really looking for.
For the costs or for the technology or both?
For becoming cost-effective in various states because of the electricity costs in those states or for various applications.
Right. Well, of course, this is back to the consumer preferences. Now, some people are, already moving into storage, and, you have the Tesla Powerwall, and some people want to have greater degrees of reliability, and so they're willing to make that kind of a purchase. I don't know exactly what that will mean in terms of going forward. I think what we're going to be doing, as I mentioned, is to try to keep the technology advancing, the costs coming down, so it's available to a broader community, but the real breakthroughs are still a ways away. What we hope to see, and this is starting to emerge in terms of the prototypes, so we hope that there will be, in the not too distant future, the day when you actually won't need a power supply cord for your computer. If you leave on Monday and return on Friday, you've got a full charge that will last you the week. Similarly, when you drive your electric vehicle, leave on Monday, return on Friday, you can go on a single charge. Those are the kinds of advances that we can see just now creeping in. But it's all going to take a while to become commercially available. And again, it's going to be in the eyes of the consumer how much they want to pay for those customer benefits and that convenience of not bringing power supply cords. This is all very, it's not monolithic. And so it's very much driven, again, by the customer and what they want and what they value. Thank you for your question. Hi.
So you mentioned on a couple of slides distributed optimization. So I was interested because, especially in at the transmission level, there's so many different ISOs and grid operators throughout the country, and each of them have different ways that they optimize grid dispatch. Does EPRI work with individual utilities on any kind of collaborative project to try to set standards for what distributed optimization might be for distribution level grid dispatch? What is that going to look like going forward from a kind of national perspective on the development of that?
Great question. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing in a word that I should have used from the very beginning, which is collaborate. So EPRI's business model is to collaborate with utilities who voluntarily fund our programs and services. We are not a standard-setting body in terms of perhaps what you're leading to, but what we're trying to do is to gain technical insights into the distribution system. Also, one of the big challenges right now, because of this bidirectional power flow that's emerging, is you want to have a seamless communication between the transmission system operator and the distribution system operator. That wasn't as important when everything was going just in one direction. But now, if you've got it going back and forth between the two of them, they need to be able to speak the same language. In other words, similar communication standards so that they understand mutually what's going on. So that's a huge area of work that we're doing. So we're not setting the exact standards, but we're providing technical information to those entities who do so that they have the benefit of that.
Would it be like NERC or NIST or someone who would actually maybe move forward with standards for that kind of thing?
Yeah, and IEEE is actually another major standard setting body, as you may know. Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. Other comments? Got it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned situational awareness and the growth of devices both at the IoT level as well as transmission and distribution level. I was wondering, does EPRI see changes in control room design and workflows, and also as you look at consumers having more situational awareness as well, do you expect to see more, say, altruistically defined demand response or more market-based demand response?
That is a great question. So yes, I think everyone will have more situational awareness. I mean, if you have, I'll just use this as an example, not as an endorsement, but if you have like a Nest thermostat, you have a lot more knowledge of what's happening in terms of the energy management in your home. You can even leave your home and you can still interact with your energy system in your home, change it, tweak it, adjust it, however you want to do it. That's a much greater level of situational awareness that the homeowner, the consumer has. Yes, with those sensors that I described that will convey intelligent communications, but we need to deploy across the entire system, yes, that will give everybody, in fact, back to that question about TSO, DSO interface, why that will give everybody a lot better opportunity for the situational awareness. Now, how people act with that information is very interesting. So you may be aware that there's a company named O-Power that was recently acquired by Oracle. So O-Power has been examining how consumers behave for about the last decade first in energy efficiency, how to save energy, but after about 3 or 4 years, they were challenged to actually look at how customers use demand response. Remember, that's the ability to not have energy for short periods of time or less energy, so that then you perhaps are paid for that, or you also may have a lower bill. So what they are finding and what they're looking at is persistence. So you may, for example, on a hot day, be willing to have your thermostat lowered a couple of degrees for 15 minutes. But would you do that on day 2 of a heat spell? Would you do that on day 3? Would you do that next month if the heat spell returns? Those are the kinds of factors, and everybody's not the same, but what they're finding is that people tend, with information, comparing their past behavior with their current behavior, comparing their behavior with their neighbors, their comparable neighbors' behavior, that they tend to respond persistently over the years. Now, again, we're 10 years out, but to some extent, I would say, is that an altruistic motivation or is that a competitive motivation? Hard to say, but definitely people are responding. Do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist turned engineer, so I guess I've looked at it from both sides. The challenges that I've read about the O-Power approach where you create competition, they've done a lot of similar studies on things like exercise, and what they find is there's often a regression to the mean. If you're competing with your friend to see who works out the most, maybe that will motivate you, but if your friend falls off the wagon, you're going very likely to quickly fall off too. And unfortunately, both mechanisms are negatively reinforcing, meaning that these people are competing with each other to not be the worst off, which is actually a form of induced stress. And so there's actually quality of life factors that become problematic.
Interesting. So do you have a solution for all of us to be
Yeah.
altruistically motivated?
Sure. Well, I mean, with my own, with some of the work that I did when I was at ERCOT, we did altruistic demand response, and what we found is that just by creating the perception, especially among millennials, that you are part of a bigger system and your behavior matters, will induce people to start making changes, for the greater good.
Sounds good.
So
Sounds
it's
good.
positive. Negative reinforcement and punishment fade very quickly when whatever the the stick is fades. Just like kids who are punished for bad behavior tend to behave well in front of their parents but badly elsewhere. So positive is the only reinforcement type that kind of creates sustainable change.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much for your insight. You're in a great field too. I mean, this is a very rich body of work right now, as I'm sure you're
Thank you.
feeling. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Other?
Yeah, this is great, and there's a lot of opportunity here. So from your perspective, what do you see as some entrepreneurial opportunities within this new business, utility business model moving forward?
That is a great question. There are so many changes. Are you thinking in terms of technology? Are you thinking in terms of the actual business model itself? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of dots to be connected between giving the utility some money back if you're going to be taking demand from them. So you mentioned, for instance, the value of a DER depending on where it's positioned. And there seems opportunity there for somebody to jump into that market and be able to provide value to everybody.
There's certainly, I mean, from the work we're doing with our pilots and with our studies, I mean, there's certainly work to be done to understand it a lot better, because until you have the understanding, you can't really be out with an entrepreneurial activity or even giving advice. So a big part of this is really trying to achieve a level of sophisticated understanding. Fred and I were discussing this actually about an hour ago, where, I mean, it's like an aha now. It's like, who would have thought? Who would have thought that it's so important if it's south-facing or west-facing and it's on this house and not that house, and it can impact the whole system if it's here and not there, and it can actually help the system if it's there and not here? I mean, who would have thought that it would be that specific? But it is. And so, I mean, that kind of knowledge, that introduces the prospects, I would say, for an entrepreneurial activity of some kind. But the knowledge comes first.
Great, thank you.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh-huh. Good, thank you. Great question.
Hey, thank you. Going back to demand response and behavior, have you noticed anything with regard to income levels and behavior? And have you maybe provided information to lower income people about, as far as saving on power and conserving and lowering their bills?
Yes, there has been a lot of communication, consumer education efforts. I mean, you know, I think we all share the need for more education in all forms of technology developments here. So yes, there's a lot of concern about social equity issues, which is one reason that we're conducting this. In fact, it was actually a state public utility commissioner who came to EPRI and said, I'm having to make some very difficult decisions with some of these rate filings and state proceedings, and I need information. I need good, solid technical information, because there's a lot of passion on both sides, on the many sides of this debate. There are potentially social equity issues that I need to resolve around this, and I need information that is technically reliable, accurate, and defensible. So at least when I render my opinion and make a decision, I feel like I'm being backed up by something I can count on. And that's essentially why we did this. You're absolutely right, because there's a concern that particularly if you have solar PV being placed on rooftops by more affluent people and then selling it back into the system, and there's a perception that that T&D system that is actually allowing that whole exchange to happen is not being properly valued, that it will be low-income people who can't afford PV who will then be asked to subsidize the T&D system, which has to be upgraded to allow for the affluent customers to do what they want to do. So there's a lot of discussion around that. There are a lot of other organizations involved in that space, including the public utility commissions, but also the trade associations and other, and our job is to just make sure that we keep pushing out this technical information so everybody's as well informed as possible. We don't do policy and regulatory rate making, but what we try to do is inform those people so that they can make the best possible decisions. Thank you for your question. Other comments, questions?
Oh, I get to ask one.
Oh, good, Fred.
I haven't asked you this one yet. You do a great deal of research, hardware research, technology research. One that's always fascinated me and that I feel is perhaps one of the biggest game changers that can happen in the next 10 to 15 years is vehicle to grid, where when we do have a fairly large penetration of not just hybrid plug-ins and all electrics, but even in some ways even more the hybrid plug-ins, where it's not just a battery that's being plugged in to the home by the vehicle, there's also a generator there. Have you looked at what that really means? So it's not just putting a few solar panels on a roof now, it's actually installing a power plant in the garage and plugging it into the home, which is connected to the grid.
Yes.
Do you have any feel for where that technology can go, how fast that might evolve, and what the impact of that would be, especially locationally, like as we've talked about?
Great question. So that is something that is on the long-term horizon. I will say it's not something that's going to happen immediately, but that is something that could happen where you could, as Fred has just expressed, actually sell back into the grid. And that's something that's very real and very possible, but it will be part of a longer-term future. It's not going to be an imminent development.
Oh, really? I figured I would have hacked my Chevy Volt already. I'm ready to do it.
Yeah, he's charging right now. We just drove over here in a Chevy Volt. He is actually charging, but not back into the system at this point. But that future exists for you, Fred, and for everybody else. So thank you very much for that. Anybody else have a comment or a question?
Great. Well, Barbara, thank you very much for
Thank you,
coming.
everybody.
We really enjoyed your talk.